35 million open surgeries in the US every year, and the core tool used in almost every single one of them hasn't changed much since the 1920s. Paul Davison is a CEO and co-founder of Lamina Surgical. He spent 30 years building devices at Baxter, Medtronic, ArthroCare, and Peak Surgical, where he led development of the plasma blade before Medtronic acquired the company. He knows electrosurgery as well as anyone, and now he's building a more advanced version of that technology with integrated imaging that lets surgeons see blood flow and tissue planes they've never been able to see before. In this episode, we talk about why being willing to pivot can matter more than your original concept, the path from engineer to founder, and how early stage founders are using AI tools to do more with less. Let's get into it.
This is Stories in Life Sciences brought to you by MedAccess AI, where we explore how ideas move from discovery to real-world impact.
Today, I've got Paul Davison here. Welcome to the podcast today, Paul. Currently CEO of Lamina Surgical, but a broad array of background and different medtech entrepreneurial journeys. I'm really excited to dig in.
Thank you for having me, Christopher. This is fun. I enjoy sharing and giving back.
We found that we share a common connection. With Paul was at ArthroCare, which then got acquired by Smith & Nephew, which I worked at too. So I'm really interested in learning more about Paul's journey and just where he's got at Lamina. So Paul, you just want to share a little bit about kind of your journey into, med tech and where you started and kind of leading up to where you're at now?
My journey started when I was 19. I worked in a factory at Baxter Healthcare in Los Angeles making medical devices on swing shift. While I went to studied undergrad engineering at Cal Poly Pomona, I essentially built and tested and inspected medical devices from the hands-on standpoint. Upon graduation, I became a manufacturing engineer at Baxter. It was a great foundational opportunity for me because at the time they were the largest med tech in the world. The factory had 1,300 employees. We had pretty much all processes from molding, extrusion, assembly, sterilization, testing. So we built devices from resin to ship to customers and warehouses. The whole process, we were making all sorts of things at the Baxter facility I was at. I went into cardiovascular, worked on heart catheters as an engineer, became a program manager. I actually started out studying aerospace engineering, and I started working there and realized, okay, I'm going to switch to manufacturing, mechanical, something more general to really pivot myself into the medtech space. So I had the hands-on experience, transitioned that into an engineering role upon graduation, worked up the engineering ladder, ultimately became responsible for a handful of manufacturing plants, being a part of a advanced manufacturing group. Baxter started to split into multiple companies, Allegiance, and that eventually became part of Cardinal Health. So I ended up transferring or landing a position at Medtronic. Okay. So I was in Southern California. Some people I was working with at Medtronic went to ArthroCare in the early stages and convinced me to go with them into an R&D role. And
so how did the transition from Baxter to Medtronic happen?
Oh, it was, like I was saying, Baxter was going through a lot of organizational changes. The company went into streamlining their business into higher margin and lower margin scenarios. And the factory I was at in Irwindale, California closed. That was disseminated into various facilities around the world, ultimately transitioned into Cardinal Health. I went to Edwards in Irvine for Baxter after that. It's now a company, Edwards Life Sciences, but that used to be part of Baxter.
That doesn't seem like a fit like in modern day times, like those two companies. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so Baxter had a cardiovascular business. Interesting enough, there were technologies that are just emerging in recent times that were, there, like, ultrasound catheters for, treating blocked arteries, like what Shockwave just sold. We had a lithotripsy catheter back then. It just, it was in the early stages of that sort of, technology. We had a catheter to do direct visualization of arteries, angiography, essentially just, looking at arteries with the camera and flushing with saline, traditional heart catheters. This was before stenting. So that's where I started to get some cardiovascular experience. That's why I ended up with the role at Medtronic eventually, because they had a catheter business. Ultimately, they ended up getting into stenting. They bought AVE up in Santa Rosa. They combined the facility I was at in San Diego with the group in Santa Rosa. And that was the time where I made that transition to Silicon Valley.
Okay.
Many, many medical devices are developed and developed in Silicon Valley. Once learned, you should, try to fish where the fish are, or go where the market is for things. And obviously a natural fit to go there if I was going to start working on devices from their early stages to commercialization. Yeah. Some Medtronic people I was working with went to ArthroCare. That ArthroCare was founded to essentially use RF for chronic total occlusions. The goal was to use RF to ablate through lesions in the coronary tree. Or one of the co-founders here at Thapleal, he was involved in the early stages of directional atherectomy, which sold to ACS, which became part of Guidant and now Abbott. Here at Thapleal was involved with CVIS and DVI, and then he started ArthroCare with a physicist. And I was working with him and some others on a catheter, and that's why he founded ArthroCare, was to do CTOs, chronic total occlusions for coronary vascular disease.
Really?
Turned out there was an investor in ArthroCare. His name is Steve Garvey. There's a Harvard Business Review study about it. I believe he was with Med Ventures, but he thought that ArthroCare should pivot and do some things with the core RF technology to use it in some other areas associated with a Class 2 regulatory approval. And thus, they tried it in arthroscopy, another wet field application, and it worked out to be a great device for ablating, connective tissue, controlling bleeding, and joint surgery or sports medicine surgeries, and became a standard of care. Eventually, ArthroCare licensed it to Smith & Nephew, where you used to work, Christopher, and ultimately Smith & Nephew bought the company, but they did licensing deals with J&J, Stryker. It's really a standard in that space. And so while there, I pivoted. I was working on the heart catheter, and then, I'm like, okay, I'll work on these, wands for arthroscopy. We scaled it to ENT, spine. We licensed a device I co-invented. It was a bipolar loop for doing transurethral resection of the prostate, TURP surgery. ACMI licensed that. It's a great case study. I mean, it's in the book Biodesign, which is used at Stanford.
I did that program there.
Yeah. See, I know, and associated with a lot of, I guess, things that are written about in that book, and ArthroCare is one of the case studies, and it's a great example of pivoting. A situation where you have a platform technology and, finding homes for it. Usually there's specific devices that, find it, or there's inventors that find a need for something, and then they invented a specific device around that and then scale it. You had this platform technology that was going to be implemented on a catheter, and they ended up putting it on, endoscopic length wands, and then scaling the company that way. ArthroCare had this platform where we weren't all sure how many surgeries it was going to apply to and where it's going to be used. So, but this was in the 90s, and the company was able to go public with about $4 million in revenue, and so there was funding to figure things out.
I was going to say, that sounds fun. Also, like overwhelming a little bit too, or you can get a little lost in if you can do everything. That makes sense too. It always seemed to me that ArthroCare technology was so amazing with Smith & Nephew, but it was like it was over-engineered for arthroscopy. Like it was so good, not in a bad way over-engineered, but it's just with the foundation of what you're speaking to makes more sense, that they were looking at kind of the different application out of the gates, but that ended up working really well in that application.
Yeah. And to the founders' credit at ArthroCare, they certainly were implementing an MVP before, minimum viable product concept was even being talked about too much, because the early Arthro ones were this really crude, skin-colored, conical handle with no branding, a stainless steel shaft, and a bunch of, electrodes at the tip with no hand control. The arthroscopy, or the orthopedic surgeon was using foot control. The settings were like 1 through 9 on the generator. It was very, very basic, no software, all fixed logic on the hardware side. And they figured out it was working. Orthopedic surgeons would take it for a test drive and realize that it was, 20 times better than a wet field Bovie.
Yeah. Wow.
And the things you had with fancy hardware and really nice cables, and at that point they actually had a reusable cable that hooked into the back of the conical handle, so the hospitals would have to wash the cable. And I wish they still had that. I really am disappointed that the market has completely shifted towards disposable cables, but the expense in a hospital to re-sterilize and clean cables has caused that. Yeah. Regardless, the early arthro ones were truly MVP, and then they became very highly engineered outside of just the distal tip that was in the surgical space. Everything about them, branding, handles, the optionality with foot control and nicer generators and so on. So they did a great job with an MVP, and then having some OEM partners locally in the Bay Area, and then bringing manufacturing in-house once it scaled. And then ultimately they developed a couple of 50,000 square foot manufacturing facilities in Costa Rica, where, Smith & Nephew products are made as well. And, really scaled that company in a great way.
That sounds like fun.
But it was a lot of fun. And that was really a platform for me to get the startup.
Yeah, and then tell me about that. Then what the transition out of ArthroCare to then go into your first, kind of startup journey?
Once ArthroCare became, a large company, 1,000+ employees, they were a public company. They were looking to enhance bottom line numbers because they were public. They, implemented, nearshore manufacturing.
All those things sound less fun.
Company,
those are the less fun things.
There's
that transition.
Yeah, once you're in Silicon Valley inventing things, you're kind of like, whoa. It was fun going down to Costa Rica, transferring products down there. I surf for a hobby. You can see one of my big wave boards behind me here, but I was able to go to Costa Rica and help with bringing products down there, and usually segue some surfing on those trips as well. But ArthroCare also decided to move their business operations from Sunnyvale in Silicon Valley to Austin. There were some tax advantages, some other opportunities that the CEO decided to take advantage of. And so that was a point where I realized, okay, I'm going to move to Austin or, do something else. Ironically, around that time, some people at Stanford University, a finance person that was connected to the chair of ophthalmology at Stanford, were starting a concept. They had started to try to commercialize a eye surgery technology with Zeiss. That wasn't working out. And they had this concept for, doing RF electrosurgery with high current density at the tip, and a novel insulation scheme, and a way to do, low thermal spread electrosurgery. But they were going to implement it in the eye for doing capsulotomies, doing macular degeneration surgery in the back of the eye, for, work on the Xi. There's microbleeding back there. So they were essentially competing against pharmaceutical industry, phacoemulsification, which is ultrasound, to do, capsulotomies, to put in intraocular lenses. They're competing against laser for doing various trimming, dissection in the eye. And so it was a neat concept, but there weren't predicates in the RF space versus laser and ultrasound. There weren't in pharma. The markets were, there's not a lot of bleeding either. So RF is great when you have, notable bleeding. Had suggested, well, this would be better for open surgery. They believed us, and a coworker and I from ArthroCare started Peak Surgical as a result of this. And so it went from being a project Stanford was doing with Zeiss, who specializes in, neuro and eye surgery. They have a lot of optics.
How did the introduction happen? How did you find them? How did that work?
Well, they found us, and ArthroCare was a pioneering company in RF, and they had an RF concept. They also had access to funding. So for John Ty and myself, who we co-started Peak, this was great, right? We had immediate funding, and so I was able to do ArthroCare, right? Take this core technology, and in our case, make it into something that was in a handheld device for open surgery. At ArthroCare, you had a catheter, and that concept transitioned into these handheld devices for wet field arthroscopy in the joint. So it was almost a similar equation and playbook, and we had funding. So we were able to essentially develop these handheld probes for open surgeries. We didn't know where they were going to be used. Many of these surgeries we didn't have experience with, and most of the funding for surgery at that time was transitioning into minimally invasive catheter-based surgeries. The early days of or implants that were going to scaffold arteries or keep an aneurysm closed. Fancy visualization equipment really geared towards doing laparoscopic, minimally invasive surgery. We're essentially developing a device to compete with a $5 to $10 Bovie that's used in almost all surgery. It's like trying to compete against a scalpel for the skin. So it's like, we didn't know what we were doing. I mean, it's like, what's going on here? We took this big risk and took it one step at a time. We knew we had something that had lower thermal spread, almost no smoke. It was very precise. So the foundation of it was solid.
That, to some people who don't know, like a Bovie, it's basically like cauterizing, but it's like you're doing it in a much more delicate way with what you're doing.
Chris, for surgery is essentially, a scalpel to cut skin. And then subcutaneously or beneath the skin, you use a Bovie. Bovie is a little blade, a little spatula blade. It's about 2.5 inches long that essentially dissects as it controls bleeding. And when you encounter larger bleeders, you essentially perform a static coagulation. Bovies have two modes. It's cut, that's the yellow button, and coag is the blue button. These hand pieces connect to radiofrequency generators that are outside of the sterile field, and they deliver power to the electrode tip that's doing the cutting and the bleeding control. They operate, generally surgeons use them between about 20 and 50 watts. There's edge cases lower and higher than that. And those generators are power control, so they're trying to keep the power constant. ArthroCare system was voltage control because you're working in a wet field. There's a known impedance with the saline in the joint. That's a voltage control system, a completely different scenario for a wet field versus like open surgery dry field, which is power control. Open surgery is also a great application. It's a better application for monopolar versus bipolar as well. So the ArthroCare system is what's called sequential polar, and it's often labeled as bipolar. That's another discussion. But in open surgery, monopolar is great because you have the patient, it can be the ground. You attach a ground pad to the patient, so you have this large ground essentially to work with. So you don't have to worry about alternating the polarity from, the electrode to the ground. It just really focuses on the electrode at that point. Open, monopolar electrosurgery as a blade. There's a handpiece for cutting coag and it hooks into a generator. The modern version of it was developed in the 1920s at Harvard by a physicist named William Bovie. He licensed it to Harvard for $1. And a neurosurgeon named Harvey Cushing used it for the first case or human case at Harvard for a neurosurgery in 1928. And prior to that, surgeries like that could take multiple sittings or days because the patient would bleed out otherwise. So it was a massive foundational breakthrough in medicine. D'Arsenal had a system in France in the late 1800s. It wasn't necessarily safe. It needed refinements. And William Bovie's system really became the platform that, went forward. It was the standard for doing, subcutaneous or, subskin surgery for accessing anything, tumor, an organ. an implant, putting in, taking out an implant. So it's been the standard. It's been commoditized. There's 35 million open surgeries in the U.S. annually. And so there's probably, 34 to 34.5 million Bovies used. It's a foundational technology, but it is biased towards bleeding control. It's very hot. So there's a lot of tissue burning, smoke. And as a result, there's notable inflammation response. You have serous fluid buildup. There's pain, so narcotics are prescribed. It's being mandated in more and more states to require smoke evacuation systems. The devices have suction tubes on them now, or there's integrated smoke evac. Nurses often hold a yank hour tip, suction tip in the field. Ironically, I used to mold those at Baxter in the late 80s when I was a technician. That was one of the machines I used to, run and inspect parts from, yank hour tips.
Okay.
That's another ubiquitous tool. It's in surgery. It's a little clear, handheld device that essentially is like 6 inches long. It has a little bulb on the tip, and hospital ORs and surgery centers hook it into a suction machine. And that's what sucks out fluid and smoke in a
I've
surgery.
seen it. Yeah. I just didn't know what the history behind it.
So
Interesting.
So full circle, I used
Make
to
those.
work on those at Baxter late 80s as a technician when I was in undergrad. And so these Bovies really hadn't been disrupted or engineered for improvement relative to their thermal spread, to non-target tissue, and their overall performance. They're just kind of treated like a scalpel in surgery. So at Peak, to get back to your original question, Christopher, I know that was a big roundabout, but we, and I think it's important to provide some historical context
I
there.
I learned. I mean, I've seen a lot of Bovies. I had no idea the history behind it and the origination and how long ago it was. Yeah, it was fascinating. Yeah.
And then a lot of voltage. Like I said, there's 20 to 50 watts of power, but voltage delivery is 500 to 5,000 volt range, depending on if you're in cut or coag and which mode you're using and what your field you're working with. There's multiple variables there, but it's a lot of voltage, and that's why those tips can arc discharge from the tip and create what looks like a lightning bolt as you're operating. And if there's instruments in the field that are conductive, or there's an implant you're working around, you can burn the polymer on an implant, or you can arc to a metal retractor, or arc to a non-target tissue in the field. There's some notable safety issues with Bovie and surgery. And so the plasma blade, which I led development for, addressed a lot of those issues by implementing a more precise energy delivery, an enhanced insulation scheme that enabled that to happen. And so it was a better balance between like cut and coagulation. It really focused the energy to target tissue, minimized and in some cases eliminated the probability of safety issues in the collateral areas, either with non-target tissue or instruments or implants. So we found homes for that technology that had the greatest needs, and we tried it in dozen or so procedures. And
how did you go about that? Trying it in different procedures, like in lab or
partnering with different surgeons and having them come to the office and use it on store-bought tissue and doing simulated surgeries. And having surgeons come in and, try it for different procedures they would use a Bovie for. We saw initially from the visceral reaction of the surgeon that, okay, we have something here. Let's fine tune this and let's go after this market. Let's do some market research. Let's figure out how we can, go down that pathway.
And then how does Peak then lead to where did like acquisition by Medtronic, and how does that, And I guess the other question is, like, when you were doing that back in those days, did you ever see it being as big as it is now?
I'm a product development person. So my goal is just really focus on, solving problems and developing devices that help surgeons and patients or providers and patients. And so I haven't really focused on the economics and the finance side of things too much until, in recent years. But, you trust the people you're working around, the markets, and if you do good things will happen. The economics worked out really well for that plasma blade, breast oncology and electrophysiology. Electrophysiology is Bovies, when they did revision procedures, would burn the insulation on the leads. And we found with the plasma blade that didn't happen. And so when leads were burnt during battery changeouts or revision procedures, it's another surgery. You have to do a lead removal or track leads over existing leads, and it's a real hassle. There's a mortality rate associated with that, a couple percent. So it just addressed a massive pain point, safety pain point. So it was adopted heavily in electrophysiology. In breast oncology, they're very concerned about thermal margins or margin reads of healthy tissue to cancer. If you have a device that has 5x, 7x less thermal spread than the predicate, it helps them with their margin reads. Also in breast oncology surgery, mastectomy, you're often doing an inframammary incision, and overhead light, you can't see very well from doing a parallel surgery to the patient versus a perpendicular surgery. So if you're trying to access lymph nodes or make tissue planes between breast tissue and muscle and fat, it's hard to see in there. So the Bovie would smoke up the cavity. So we also implemented a light on the Bovie, and I got that idea from Scott Spear, who was a plastic reconstructive surgeon at Georgetown. I actually saw him do a bilateral mastectomy, one with the plasma blade, one with Bovie. And I saw on the Bovie side, he taped a fiber optic light to the top of the Bovie. And I was like, oh, let's put a light on our device. So that's where that idea came from. Plasma blade, it was highly adopted in that procedure because of less smoke, lower thermal spread on the margins, and better visualization. The CEO of Peak, he had a connection with somebody at Medtronic from his ArthroCare days. Obviously, Medtronic is one of the leaders in pacing, and we're doing these like lead extraction procedures. They loved what we were doing in breast oncology. They saw some other applications in ear, nose, and throat for their surgical technologies business. And so that's why Medtronic got involved in business development and then ultimately buying the company.
And then after that, I noticed like you were at ConMed for a while as well, right? So I feel like you've done kind of the bigger than small. I don't know what size ConMed was now. I think of them as, medium size or smaller size, but then just talk about that. Like it feels like you've weaved in back to smaller and then slightly larger and then where you're at now too, starting up in the startup again.
I feel like this has just happened to me by chance or being in the right place, or also just making, decisions that made sense to leverage experience and skills. And ConMed was one of the companies that was interested in buying Peak. They were doing due diligence. They were looking at us. And so I started to develop a relationship with the head of R&D and one of the president within the organization as well. And they offered me, independently after the integration with Medtronic was over, a position to, start an R&D office in the Bay Area for electrosurgery. As you can see, I had this ArthroCare experience. I had this open surgery experience. ConMed, they had a wet field Bovie at Tech, which was part of ConMed. And that's their arthroscopy sports medicine business. They had Bovies. They were number 2 in Bovie volume behind Valley Lab, which is now part of my Medtronic. Ironically, Medtronic owns Valley Lab. That's the market leader in Bovies. And they own Peak. So they kind of have the high end. They have the whole market, right? So ConMed is number 2 in electrosurgical pencils. And so they were interested in an arthroscopy system. I hired a small team and we developed an arthroscopy system for ConMed. We had this grand plan that, we were going to develop all these great RF devices for ConMed. Do this arthroscopy system and then, do all kinds of things. But then there was an activist investor group that went after ConMed, and he took over the company from the founder of ConMed, Eugene Corsani, founded it in the 50s. his son, Joseph Corsani, ran the company for many years. Activist investors started to kind of go after the company. He decided to retire. And so there was this lack of any interest in R&D.
I remember I had
It
some
was all
friends there at
like
that time, but I didn't know what was going on.
Kurt Hartman, who I think he had some Stryker experience. He was an executive there at one time. He was at a fund that was one of the minority owners or investors in ConMed stock. And he really like streamlined the company. They bought a laparoscopic cannula that did really well after that. Their stock was 25 bucks a share when I started. When I left there, the stock was 45 bucks a share. I think it got up to around 100 during their peak.
But what are you up to now? Like at Lamina, what are you excited about with what you're working on?
So many things have connected back to Medtronic, ArthroCare, and Peak, and at Lamina. My co-founder Jason Hegener and I, we've worked together at a few companies already. He was actually at ArthroCare after I was, and so Jason and I have developed a lot of devices together. And we decided that the stars aligned, the timing was good, our experience was ideal for doing something on our own, and electrosurgery and imaging. What we're doing is we're making surgery safer. And we're focusing on open surgery, which is a third of all surgery. Like I said, 35 million open procedures in the US every year. And it's growing at 9% annually for the last 10 years. And we're essentially making a more advanced version of the plasma blade. We have our own intellectual property fence we're developing around what we're doing as well. And we have an imaging product that will enable physicians that don't have direct magnification visualization now. They're just using their eyes or eyepieces, headlamps to essentially see things that they haven't been seeing before, whether it's just seeing things up close or with more magnification, in other words, blood flow, bacteria. We're integrating different modes into our imaging, and we're connecting these all to perform safer surgery. So the goal is to go after some procedures that have high failure rates, large pain points and problems, some areas that we didn't get to at Peak. Medtronic, it doesn't focus on, and go after those procedures. So we are a startup. We are at seed stage. Most of our investors are surgeons that ultimately use these products, become customers, or know a lot about surgery, electrosurgery. It's a very difficult period to fund startups in the initiation and pre-seed phase currently. Most of the money is shifted to Series A and B, where more risk is taken out and so on. But Jason and I are experienced operators. We've de-risked this in some significant ways already. We've executed in the space. We have 21 FDA cleared devices on the market between us, 16 US patents issued between us. We're innovators, but I've been on multiple executive teams now, and this is my first CEO role, raising money and building a company from scratch. So I've just been around a lot of wonderful people in my career that have really set me up to do this at this stage of my life. We have network for all these important aspects of building a business that we can use to complement these AI tools, agentic tools that we're using to get this off the ground with limited funds. It's going to help us scale to that point where we have FDA clearance, we have human data, we have business model and commercialization worked out, and great silos of success that enable us to not just fall apart or disappear after FDA clearance, right? We're planting all those fields now with these tools and people in our network and consultants, and then obviously we'll scale into hiring more people as we go forward. But it's taking a lot of expenses, reducing expenses, and allowing us to perform at a very high level very early as a startup. So we're very excited about these tools helping us build this business.
That's exciting to me too. That's what my hope is, because like you said, the capital constraint is real from that early stage process. But when you're leaning on some of these technologies that could be super helpful at that stage, to kind of accelerate that path to market and lean on. It's like having another yeah, like another person, like for HR. Like for me, like I'll train a skill in Claude Anthropic, and that's my HR person now. And like it's just amazing what you can do.
Well, you get three because you can go from Claude to Anthropic to
Yeah.
ChatGPT to Gemini, and you kind of like, okay, wow, I've got these multiple data sets in front of me now. Let me look at them, and okay, I have a brain, I have experience, and I have colleagues, and let's all talk about this now. Let's make a
Yeah.
decision. But it just, yeah, it's unbelievable to consolidate so many sources so quickly, and then also have specific tools that are doing things directed towards your industry or your space too, that also use the same tools within their
Yeah.
prompts, and rolling that all up using general platforms to specific to human brain power and network, and just it's
So
so
powerful.
powerful.
It
It's
is
very
exciting. It
exciting.
like changes every week. It just blows me away. And my hope is that it gets more technologies to market faster. It just that gets that process less ideas sitting on the shelf somewhere because they didn't get funding or they couldn't scale fast enough. It's just this my hope that just alleviates some of that strain when you're really early and limited by budget and numbers of people, that this helps just more of them out there in the world. So yeah, that's exciting. So I guess to close out here, Paul, just any advice that you have for someone early stage, whether maybe they're at that bigger company or jumping out into their own or that early company. I know one you said is I was kicking myself when I did biodesign down there in the Bay and we bought a company in Menlo Park. I should have moved at that time. Be where it's at, I think, is one piece that I'm seeing. God, it was something was telling me, and I got an offer to go down there, and I didn't go. But that's another story. But yeah, anything else that you have just to share with people that were in your position back then?
Yeah, location is a big deal relative to the space you're going into. Building experience that enables you to use technologies and tools to advance what you're doing. Hard work as well. It's these medtech particularly is not
No,
easy.
it's not.
It's a highly regulated, great experience. Understanding that it's hard, but it's very rewarding and meaningful
Yeah.
work. And so I've enjoyed that about it. Aligning your education and learning new things constantly is fantastic. So learning and taking risk.
Mm,
That's the other thing. Other advice I'd give. And it was scary to come to Silicon Valley. Everything was twice as expensive in terms of my life, in terms the basic things like housing, for example. And there were a lot of sacrifices, but it was, it took risk, and but I was learning like crazy. That's very like
yeah.
invigorating. And so that's something I want to keep doing, is keep learning and taking risks that make sense, but also de-risking things as you move things forward as well, and understanding when you need to like exit something and pivot. I think having good failure criteria and pivoting and not being stubborn about something is important as
Yeah, I
well.
so agree. I see some early stage, especially engineers or clinicians, holding on really tightly to that like initial concept and not really desiring to want to pivot. So just having that flexibility. From your story, I mean, all some of the concepts had nothing to do with what the end result was at all. So having
Oh, I
that,
know. It's
yeah.
just
Plus, I mean,
Oh, absolutely. And not being afraid, the risk thing. I never worked on a monopolar electrosurgical device before, co-starting and running development for Peak Surgical.
in closing, Paul, where can people keep track of what you're up to now? I mean, is LinkedIn for you, or the website for Lamina to kind of keep track of what's going on and what the future holds?
Yeah, Paul Davison at MedTech on LinkedIn, and www.laminasurgical.com is the company webpage. You're always looking for partners and running a
Yeah.
company, whether you're Google or you're Lamina Surgical, right? And so that's always of interest to me, to develop more partners that we can mutually benefit each other. We're in this journey now of product development, and we're going to transition that into commercialization and scaling from
Perfect.
there.
Well, thanks so much for your time, Paul. Today was really Yeah, fun to just learn more about your journey. I'm excited to follow and keep up with where Lamina heads. And yeah, it sounds like you're on your way to solving another problem. You've solved a few of them over your time in this space and just doing it the right way. So thank you so much.
You're
All right.
welcome,
Bye.
Christopher. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Stories in Life Sciences, sponsored by MedAccess AI, where we explore people, ideas, and breakthroughs shaping the future of biotech and healthcare innovation. To learn more, visit medaccessai.org and subscribe on YouTube to watch the full conversations and new episodes as they launch. I'm Christopher Wilson. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep shaping the future one story at a time.